Deep in the coastal mountains of western Oregon, a former Southern Pacific branch line is alive with the pulse of two-stroke diesel engines. This age-old route of the Iron Horse cuts through a scenic and seldom traveled part of the state. Since the 1880s, it has served as a connection between the Central Oregon coast and the Willamette Valley. Now operated by the Portland and Western, it provides a Georgia Pacific paper mill in Toledo with rail access to the Union Pacific Main Line, 75 miles away in Albany. In part one of this two-part series, we covered the west side along the Yaquina River and the stiff 2.58% mountain grade to the summit of the Coast Range. In part two, we continue our eastern trek beginning at Summit. The grade follows the twisting course of the Marys River toward the Willamette Valley, crossing it several times on secluded bridges, often hidden in the dense timberland. Wood chips, containerboard, recycled cardboard, and lumber are the loads that keep the rails polished as trains pass the graveyards of old mills and early communities long forgotten. The rail line breaks out of the woods at Philomath and heads through Corvallis, trading backcountry railroading for street running. EMD GP39-2s and GP40 slug sets have been the standard power on the Toledo branch for decades, and they always make a great show lugging trains over the line. From the backwoods to Main Street to the fertile fields of the Willamette Valley. This is Portland and Western's Toledo Branch, Part 2. Originally known as the Yaquina Branch, over 83 miles of railroad were completed by 1886 between its namesake town on the Oregon coast and Albany under the direction of Colonel Thomas E. Hogg. He envisioned a transcontinental railroad that would continue east over the Oregon Cascades via Santiam Pass and on to a railroad connection in Idaho. In reality, Hogg's line never made it through the mountains and ultimately terminated nearly 60 miles east of Albany at Idana, milepost 142.0. This former piece of Willamette Valley and Coast Railroad is today operated by the Albany and Eastern, with the end of track at Mill City. Two regularly scheduled trains ran over the Toledo branch, one in each direction. Beginning in 1922, Southern Pacific listed train 705, which ran between Albany and Toledo, while 706 ran in the opposite direction. These two separate trains met at Summit at 10:05 a.m. Passenger service ended in the early 1940s, and eventually one train, known as the Toledo Hauler, made the round trip as train 705 westbound and 706 eastbound. When the Willamette and Pacific began operating over the Toledo branch in 1993, the old SP tradition was remembered, with the Toledo Hauler designated as trains 75 and 76, and these job numbers remain to this day. The western portion of the Yaquina branch was abandoned by the Southern Pacific in 1936, thanks to a decline in passenger service. On a 1937 timetable, it became known as the Toledo branch. Today, we continue our journey over the eastern portion of the line beginning at Summit, milepost 728.5. From here, the railroad starts down the east side of the Coast Range on a downhill grade that reaches 1.5% at its maximum. Just as the Yaquina River provided the course for the railroad on the west side, the Marys River serves the same purpose on the east. Trains pass the former siding of Blodgett at milepost 723.2 and on through Alder, Harris, the siding of Wrens, Noon, and Flynn, which marks the bottom of the grade through the Coast Range. At this point, the railroad enters the city of Philomath and continues through the siding of Larson before entering Corvallis. After passing through the Oregon State University campus, the line turns north at Bailey Junction, milepost 703.3, as it joins part of the old Southern Pacific's West Side District. Here we can see some street running as the railroad passes down the middle of Northwest 6th Street. At Corvallis Junction, the West Side District continues north toward Portland, while the Toledo line angles to the northeast through Ashahr, Granger, and North Albany, where it crosses the Willamette River on an impressive bridge with long approaches on either side. East of the bridge, it flies over the Oregon Electric Line, also operated by Portland and Western, and reaches a junction with the Union Pacific's Brooklyn subdivision, which it must cross to enter Albany Yard at milepost 690.9. At an elevation of 704 feet above sea level, the summit of the Oregon Coast Range may seem small and insignificant when compared with the mighty Cascade Mountains towering over the eastern border of the Willamette Valley. Yet the stiff 2.5% grade out of Nashville is no small task for Portland and Western's Toledo Patch. In the tiny hamlet known as Summit, the peace and quiet of a late morning is momentarily interrupted by the pounding of pistons and squealing of wheel flanges as the heavy train grinds over the highest point on the Toledo District. Yet these rails are the reason Summit exists today. Section crews lived here during the early part of the railroad's history. They were hardy men who braved the elements of rain, snow, and some sun long before modern-day conveniences made the job of working on the railroad a little easier. A store, post office, and station made this remote place livable for railroad men and their families. In this scene, a passenger special has stopped at Summit on its westbound run. Fast forwarding 100 years, PNWR 3001 leads the eastbound Toledo Patch over the top of the grade at Summit, and the engineer prepares to drop down the east side. In a tradition going back to the Southern Pacific years, GP40 slug sets have been a regular scene on the Toledo branch. The PNW has 2 slug sets that have been assigned to this train, including the 3001, mated to Slug 101, and the 3002 with Slug 102. They made a regular appearance on the Toledo branch until early 2020, when both units were sidelined, needing major engine work. These boxcars are coming from the Georgia Pacific Paper Mill in Toledo and are loaded with containerboard, which is used in making cardboard boxes. The cars are shipped to GP's customers throughout the western states. Tucked in behind the boxcars is one load of green Douglas fir lumber from the Western Cascade Industries sawmill in Toledo. It is bound for a customer in California. Bringing up the rear of the train are wood chip gondolas, which are emptied at a rotary dumping facility in Toledo. They are quite large for a gondola due to the low density and therefore light weight of wood chips. These cars could not be filled with other commodities such as coal or ballast, as it would greatly exceed the axle load limit of the car. Many of these cars are nearly 50 years old and will soon be scrapped, having reached the end of their service life. As the train continues east of the siding at Summit, it curves around the former Summit Trestle, once known as Bridge 728B on the Southern Pacific. It was 40 feet high and stretched 568 feet over Sleepy Hollow. Eventually, the SP bypassed the trestle with a large fill on the south side. The line relocation is still visible to this day as the tracks make a jog to the right, just east of the current siding at Summit. The giant fill itself is hidden in the big timber that now towers over the little hamlet of Summit. Getting above the treetops, a late-running Toledo patch is seen crossing Happy Hollow Road as it starts down the east side of the Coast Range. Getting closer, the 5 EMDs shake the ground as the engineer transitions from power to dynamic braking for the 1% downgrade. The train curves around the former Summit Trestle site and heads for the first of 19 crossings of the Marys River, while the 4,100-foot summit of Marys Peak, the tallest mountain in the Coast Range, rises to the southeast. Due to the 10 mph speed restriction over much of the line, Portland and Western crews have nicknamed this train the Toledo Crawler. It may not seem fast, but we have found something slower. This is a banana slug, which is common in Western Oregon. They appear to serve two purposes on the railroad: inspecting rail joints and providing natural lubrication for wheels and flanges. Don't worry, this little guy gave up his track warrant long before the train with the bigger slugs came through. The grade crossing for Marvell Road marks the location of a former sawmill site that once had a spur off the Toledo branch. The spur was last listed in SP Timetable number 152, dated April 24, 1960, and is no more. Much of the journey through the Oregon Coast Range is in the concealment of a natural tunnel of surrounding trees that only occasionally let sunlight touch the rails. However, the naturally diffused light of an overcast day lends itself nicely to scenes like this as the patch job approaches Blodgett. Milepost 723.2 marks a station named for pioneer and settler William Blodgett. A post office was established here in 1888, and a small community grew next to the railroad station, which included a siding. In this view from around 1900, Corvallis and Eastern No. 6 has stopped at the station to take on freight and passengers. According to a C&E timetable dated July 2, 1900, the train left Yaquina at 7 a.m. and made a scheduled stop here at 10:10 a.m. The train ran every day but Sunday. Blodgett later became home to the Thompson Lumber Company mill, which utilized the siding here, as seen in this image from the 1950s. The mill was in operation into the early 70s. In the lower corner of this image is the Blodgett Country Store, which houses the post office as well as a walk-in cooler for your favorite beverage. Both the store and post office are still open today, and just so you know, they have some of the best milkshakes around and should be a regular stop for anyone visiting the Toledo branch. The old depot, siding, and mill are long gone, as PNWR 3002 leads the eastbound patch job through Blodgett. East of Blodgett, trains pass the former station of Alder, which had a 200-foot passing track and a pair of water tanks. In this scene from around 1910, a pole loading operation was in progress in the siding. These are the pre-Southern Pacific years, and a west-facing Corvallis and Eastern locomotive is posing on the main. Alder first appeared on a C&E timetable back in 1910, but was gone by the 1930s, although a spur track remained for quite some time. We are standing near milepost 722 looking eastward at the water tanks. The tanks lasted into the 1950s. Moving to where the tanks used to be, PNWR 2313 leads a patch past the former spur track, which was to the left of the rail. After slowly passing Alder, trains make the 15th crossing of the Marys River on the tallest existing trestle on the line. This is officially Bridge 721.49. It is 114 feet long and stands 52 feet over the river. The current structure was erected in the early 1940s. A high rail truck heads for the clear ahead of the patch job. PNWR 2301 and 3 GP39 sisters, plus a blue GP38-2 number 2152, take the train over the 15th crossing. Over the course of the railroad's history, there have been a few line relocations to eliminate unnecessary trestles and one tunnel. Probably the most interesting realignment story is what the SP did here in 1958 at what is known as the Panama Canal. In order to eliminate two aging trestles fairly close together over the Marys River, the Southern Pacific realigned the river. They dug a straight channel for the river on the south side of the tracks, and by doing so, eliminated the 13th and 14th crossings of the Marys River. To this day, railroaders still refer to this area as the Panama Canal. And from our aerial perspective, we can see the tangent course of the river to the left of the train. The railroad cuts deep into private timberland and is not easily accessed at ground level. The patch continues its eastbound run between Alder and Harris. The historic Harris-covered bridge spans the Marys River just a couple hundred feet from the grade crossing at Harris. The name Harris first appeared on an Oregon Pacific Railroad timetable in 1886 at milepost 56.2. It was named after Henry Palmer Harris, who settled here in 1875. Some of his descendants live here to this day. The name Harris last appeared in Southern Pacific Timetable number 150, dated September 30th, 1956. An interesting sidetrack is this section of log that is on display near the crossing. It was taken from a twin-topped Douglas fir tree near here and is 297 years old. The main tree is still growing and is over 11 feet in diameter, 5 feet above its base, and its age is estimated between 400 and 500 years. As for this little branch, you are welcome to count the rings if you like. Some historic pointers include the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, Abraham Lincoln's assassination in 1865, and Charles Lindbergh's solo transatlantic flight in 1927. If you stood near the grade crossing in that year, Harris would have looked more like this. Well, almost like this. The freight shed was torn down in 1920, but the spur track lasted until 1949. Milepost 717.09 marks the 7th crossing of the Marys River and a former crossing over Harris Road. In this image from 1926, Southern Pacific's Bridge and Building Gang No. 9 are at work on timber trusses. 94 years later, the bridge is still holding up as PNWR 2301 approaches milepost 717 between Harris and Wrens. Wrens is milepost 715.9 on the current Portland and Western timetable. It first appeared in 1886 on the Oregon Pacific Railroad and over the past century has played an important role on the Toledo branch. This is how the Wrens Depot looked in 1913. In a later scene from 1922, these people brave the elements in their most common form in Oregon, rain. Wrens served local sawmills with rail access. At first, lumber was shipped here by horse-drawn wagons to the railhead. It wasn't until 1941 that the first sawmill was built at Wrens. The Baron Dick and Wiseman planing mill shipped 300 carloads per year. And later, under ownership of the 3G Lumber Company, it served as a resaw for another mill in the remote community of Harlan. Like B&W, 3G shipped their lumber by train. The mill closed in 1993. A post office existed here under the name Wren, with no S, unlike the railroad spelling. It opened in 1887 and was closed in 1968. SP 8426 East An SD40 leads the Toledo hauler westbound through Wrens in this scene from the late 1960s. Notice the price of gas at 34.9 cents per gallon. In another image from the mid-1970s, SP7957 East, a GP40 TEBU slug set and 5 SD9s lead the hauler westbound through Wrens. East and west may sound a little bit confusing, and it was for a while. Details coming up. Today, the mill site is an empty lot that sometimes is used for storing maintenance of way equipment, like this BC402 brush cutter. As you have noticed, the Toledo branch can be a jungle to keep clear, and that's where this machine no doubt gets quite a workout. This is a lawnmower on steroids. The mower heads are hydraulically powered, while each arm is raised with cables and pulleys. While admiring the BC402, PNWR 2301 East is heard approaching the grade crossing at Wrens with the eastbound Toledo patch. Trains on the Toledo branch run west toward Toledo and east toward Albany. This makes sense geographically and is how the railroad was originally set up, starting with the Oregon Pacific in 1884. When the first Southern Pacific timetable took effect on July 1, 1915, mileposts were renumbered in the typical SP fashion from their headquarters in San Francisco. Wrens went from milepost 58.7, as measured from Yaquina, to milepost 715.9, measured from San Francisco. Any timetable leading away from San Francisco was considered eastbound, and vice versa. That being said, SP did not change directions on the Toledo branch immediately with the new timetable. Toledo was still railroad west of Albany. That lasted until timetable 132, dated June 17, 1940. That morning, train 706 departed Albany at 6 a.m. for Toledo, eastbound. For nearly 53 years, that stood. East was west, west was east, until the first Willamette Pacific timetable went into effect on February 22, 1993. Toledo finally regained its status of being both geographically and timetable west of Albany, Oregon. We are looking at the east switch of Wrens, which has a siding length of 705 feet. At this point, the railroad is in a northeast heading before bearing nearly due east, paralleling the Marys River. A doe is partially hidden in the grass near the curve, and if you look closely, she has two fawns who are doing their best to hide from the photographer. Also hidden from view at this curve are the remains of two wooden trestles bypassed by the Southern Pacific in the mid-1960s. They were numbered 715.42 and 715.53. Being fairly close together, they had a combined length of 594 feet and were nearly 30 feet high. Note the water barrels midway across the trestle in this undated photo. Today, stubs of the bridge pilings can still be seen in the draw on the north side of the fill. A great scene from September of 1970 shows a Toledo hauler led by 5 covered wagons on the new alignment, with some of those same stubs visible to the left of the train. Here is the same curve as it looks today. You would never know a trestle once stood there. Continuing railroad east, the Toledo branch takes a south compass heading as it more closely follows the Marys River, crossing it 5 times. A walking trail leads to a picnic bench near the secluded 4th crossing at milepost 713.8. The patch eases down a slight grade of less than 0.5% as it crosses the river. The cool waters of the Marys River flow beneath a unique structure on the Toledo branch. This is the 2nd crossing at Bridge 712.26. The steel span over the river is actually the former turntable from Yaquina. In 1937, when SP was abandoning the line west of Toledo, the 70-foot turntable deck was lifted, as seen in this image, and reused as the span for the bridge. This was by no means a unique concept for the SP, as they were well known for reusing structures. Actually, most of the bridge spans on this line came from someplace else. In fact, this is one of 8 turntable decks used as bridge spans on the Toledo branch. The telltale sign is the taper on each end of the span. The engines are in dynamics as the train makes the 2nd crossing. After departing Wrens, trains glide down a nearly steady 1% descending grade toward Flynn. Nearing the western edge of the Willamette Valley, Douglas fir and maple begin mixing with oak as we leave the wetter climate of the Coast Range. At milepost 711.35, we have come to the first, and for us, the final crossing of the Marys River. The railroad crosses the Marys River 19 times, and this is the first through truss bridge we have encountered on the line. It was originally built in 1899 and used in California, before being placed here in 1948 by the ever-frugal and resourceful Southern Pacific. The steel truss is 99 feet long and replaced an older span that was 21 feet longer. This angle shows the eastbound patch rolling over the approach to the first crossing. After crossing the Marys River for the final time, the train lumbers toward the western outskirts of Philomath and an old station called Noon. Named for William C. Noon, owner of a nearby lumber company and logging railroad, Noon is milepost 710.8, where this elevated depot once lived. You don't have to second guess what the structure used to be. Noon sold his mill to C.K. Spaulding in 1916, who founded the Marys River Logging Company. This eastbound Southern Pacific train is dragging a cut of log loads out of the Spaulding line. The remainder of its train can be seen above it on the main line. These logs will be shipped to one of Spaulding's mills in Salem or Newburgh. A modern-day glimpse of Noon shows a small spur track on the north side of the line, with a covered hopper spotted for timber supply, a customer here. On the railroad, it is referred to as the Dynamite Spur. Aside from Georgia Pacific and WCI in Toledo, Timber Supply is the westernmost customer on the branch and is served by the Corvallis Local, which we will see in a moment. On a cold, stormy night, we get a rare glimpse of the Toledo Holler on its nocturnal run through Noon. The train continues west on its nighttime journey through the Coast Range, passing the Marys River Lumber Company. This was a sawmill that specialized in western red cedar, selling to customers such as Home Depot and Lowe's. Sadly, after 42 years of production, the mill closed in 2016. These scenes were shot right after the closure, before the property was sold. Today, the mill site is a parking lot for school buses. The Corvallis Local services a Georgia Pacific planer mill at Flynn on the western end of Philomath. Lumber is trucked to the facility from area mills, and a lot of it goes out by rail. Flynn was established in 1906 when the Benton County Lumber Company built a planer mill here. A sawmill was located 7 miles southwest of Philomath along Greasy Creek, and its lumber traveled to the planer by a 6 3/4 mile long flume. Loads from GP are backed onto the main. After this task is complete, empty center beams are spotted in the yard. PNWR 2302 is a GP 39-2, like many of the units used on the Toledo train. This is a single crew job, and the engine is remote control equipped. Many of the engines utilized by the Portland and Western are named for communities served by the railroad. 2302 carries the name Adair Village, which is found on PNW's west side line north of Corvallis. The radio control allows the operator to ride the point on a reverse move like this without having to walk back to the cab of the locomotive. Speed, direction, braking, lights, even bells and whistles are all controlled from the pack. With the morning's task complete, the Adair Village heads east for Corvallis long before the Toledo patch arrives. The nighttime hauler heads through Flynn. Flynn marks the start of the grade up the east side of the Coast Range, reaching a maximum of 1.5%. The Corvallis Local has long been in the clear as the 3001 heads east through Flynn. The lead GP40 carries a name Wilsonville, while GP39 Monroe and sister engine Clatskanie finish out the power consist. Philomath was incorporated in 1882 as a prosperous farming and ranching community. It grew over the next century with the timber industry, which brought many good-paying jobs to the area. A depot was located on the south side of the tracks at milepost 708.5 and grew to accommodate both passengers and freight. Increased wartime traffic during World War II brought passenger service on the Toledo branch to an end in the early 1940s. The passenger portion was removed in 1943, and the rest was torn down 10 years later. There are several small mill sites around Philomath, including this one, marked by the teepee burner in the center of town. Near station sign Philomath, a pair of wood chip gondolas are spotted for loading. Today, the mill site serves as the Thompson Sort Yard and still has rail access. The eastbound Toledo patch rolls over the switch at milepost 708.5 near the old depot site. Today's locomotive consist includes GP39-2s, Sheridan, Lake Oswego, Monroe, and appropriately enough, Philomath. A mule train of short logs enter the Thompson Sort Yard after patiently waiting for the train. Log trucks are an everyday piece of the Philomath landscape. If you've ever wanted to ride in one or see where they go, well, come along. Unlike long-haul semi-trucks that decorate the interstates and highways across the fruited plain, log trucks leave the beaten path and often travel deep into the woods to pick up their loads. Trucks are loaded off a log deck, where logs are sorted for a specific mill. Once the truck is loaded, wrappers are added to keep the load from shifting in the bunks.
There we go.
This mule train of cut-to-length fir is bound for the SDS mill in Bingen, Washington, along the scenic Columbia River Gorge. Rough roads with steep grades can be a challenge for drivers, but they are also one of the perks, for log truck drivers have an office with some of the best scenery around. Back in Philomath, this load of long logs has arrived at a GP facility adjacent to the Thompson Sort Yard. A 988 Cat lifts the whole truckload of logs in one shot. The driver then hoists the trailer, which rides piggyback on the return trip for more logs. Heading back out of the woods, the Corvallis Local passes former mill sites at Conroy, with empty center beams for GP. The open space we are standing in was once the Philomath Forest Products Mill, which was built in 1975, and like many mills in the area, is no more. A spur track provided the mill with rail access during its operation. At dusk, the Toledo Hauler slowly rolls through Conroy at milepost 707, with wood chips and empty boxcars for the paper mill in Toledo. Conroy first appeared on SP timetable number 49, on November 4th, 1917. It was listed as a siding that could hold 6 cars. Later, it became home to the Rex Clemens sawmill and nearby veneer mill. The sawmill was built around 1940, and in this image is humming with activity on the south side of the Toledo branch. The mill changed operators over the course of its history and is no more, although the name Conroy remains on the Portland and Western timetable to this day. East of Conroy is another former mill site and 1,500-foot siding named Larson, milepost 705.8. Job 76, more commonly known as the eastbound Toledo Patch, glides down a slight grade of 0.6% in dynamics with a heavy train of containerboard on a rainy afternoon. Larson did not appear on any timetable until the Willamette and Pacific took over operations from the SP in 1992. Its name came from a sawmill built by Gordon Larson in the 1950s. It later became Midway Lumber, a name that it held for most of its existence before closing in the mid-1990s under the name WTD Industries. A City of Prineville and Southern Pacific boxcar are being picked up at Larson by SP's Wrens Turn. SD9 number 4399 powers the local on the main at Cabbage Patch, an unofficial station near the east end of the siding. Today, there isn't much activity at Larson, except the passing of the Toledo train and Corvallis Local. The Corvallis Local usually works weekdays out of a small yard just south of the junction with the Toledo branch. The yard is part of PNW's Bailey District, which runs south for 17 miles to Monroe. The Willamette Valley is rich in agricultural land, and grass seed farming is a big part of the economy. South of Corvallis, an orange GP9 number 1750, belonging to the Albany and Eastern, is tied down at Greenberry. Albany and Eastern also operates on part of Hogg's Willamette Valley and Coastline, east of Albany, to the end of track at Mill City.
All right, I got track warrant number 1919, issued to the PNWR 2005-2005, date July 21/21/2020, 2020 at Corvallis. Mark box 4, FUR work between Mopple 710 MP 710, Mopple 697 MP 697 on Toledo main track. Mark box 1616, track bolted in effect 203-203. This track burn has 2 TWO boxes marked. Their box numbers 4 FOUR 1616 over.
Bradbury box number 1919, TWR 2005-2005, 14 Mopple 710 710, and Mopple Maple 697, 697 on Toledo main track. Track horn has 2, keep your box marked. So okay time of 6:54, 0654 hours. Dispatch should be RL. Over.
After getting a warrant from the dispatcher, the Corvallis Local begins its day's activity. Today, it'll be heading east to Granger to pick up a few empty center beams for GP at Flynn. The downside of being a single-man crew is that the engineer has to get his own switches. To make the task a little easier, the 2005 can be operated by remote control. Picture running your own model train, 1-to-1 scale, with literally all the bells and whistles. The 2005 is a rebuilt GP38-3 that started life as a Southern Pacific GP35 number 7413. Later, it was sold to Utah Railway, where it became number 2005 before coming to the Portland and Western. Milepost 703.3 marks where the Toledo line meets the West Side District. In 2004, this became known as Bailey Junction, after P&W renamed the West Side line south of here to the Bailey District. At the same time, the Toledo District, which originally began at this switch, was extended east through Corvallis to Albany. At this point, street running begins as the Toledo line runs between the north and south lanes of Southwest 6th Street. A classic ball photography studio sign is a landmark near the junction. After grabbing a few empty center beams at Granger, 6 miles east of here, the Corvallis Local heads west through Bailey Junction on the Toledo District. On a warm summer's evening, the westbound Job 75, the Toledo Hauler, heads through Bailey Junction. From a field along the side of the track, we watch the hauler disappear into the sunset as it passes Oregon State University, home of the Beavers. A year later, new dormitories and a parking garage are being erected at the spot where we last stood, making a new backdrop as the patch approaches Bailey Junction. For years, 5th and 6th Streets were paved right through the tracks, making for true street running in downtown Corvallis. Now, a separator keeps motorists from driving over the tracks except for grade crossings. Another westbound hauler rolls through the heart of Corvallis. Over the years of filming the Toledo District, the train schedules have varied. Currently, at the time of this production, the hauler departs Albany around 9 p.m., making for a nighttime run through Corvallis. Tonight's train set out tank cars at Ashahr and is running about 2 hours late. Oregon wouldn't be Oregon without a little rain. The 3001 leads the patch through the all-too-common scene on a soggy afternoon. Corvallis Junction is milepost 701.5. Here, the Toledo and West Side districts go their separate ways. This junction has gone by many different names, depending on which railroad timetable you looked at. The Oregon Pacific Railroad called it Southern Pacific Crossing, since the two lines met here. SP at one time called it OC&E Crossing, and then eventually C&E Crossing for the Corvallis and Eastern, until SP took control of the Toledo line. In a vintage shot of the junction, steam was still king, as one of the trainmen from the Toledo hauler is seen flagging SP Extra 2947 through Corvallis Junction. The Corvallis and Eastern line took a different course through town, heading 3 blocks west toward 9th Street before curving west toward Toledo. It was abandoned in the 1930s, but a short segment from the junction was used for switching industry for a while. The rail line from Yaquina was completed through Corvallis in 1885, and this depot was built 2 years later by the Willamette Valley and Coast Railroad. Here is an early view of the depot, which stood near the junction at 9th and Washington. A wood-burning 440 is on the point of first-class passenger train number 1 from Yaquina. According to Oregon Pacific Timetable 4, dated November 19, 1886, this train arrived in Corvallis at 12:15 p.m., nearly 5 hours after leaving Yaquina. Not bad timing for 19th century travel through the remote coast range. An aerial view of Corvallis shows a westbound freight approaching the junction. The Corvallis and Eastern built a newer depot in 1913 next to the original WV&C depot. Both buildings are seen together in this updated view of Corvallis. At this time, the railroad was under control of the Southern Pacific. It was the fanciest depot the C&E ever erected, and it became a hub of activity during a time of big changes in Corvallis. In 1916, the SP electrified their West Side line and moved the depot from its original location at 9th and Washington to the east side of 6th Street. This was in preparation for their red electric passenger train service from Portland that by 1917 terminated at Corvallis. In this scene, a northbound traditional steam-powered passenger train has stopped at the depot, and you can see the electrified lines above the track. The C&E depot remained at 6th Street and Monroe until it was moved to its current location on Northwest 2nd Street in 1983. Today, it is home to the Old Spaghetti Factory, a restaurant chain based in Portland, and the renovated building still retains its classic railroad heritage. Back at Corvallis Junction, the eastbound Toledo patch takes the right leg toward Albany. Currently, the tangent left leg of the junction does not get much use. Portland and Western's nocturnal west sider uses a northern third leg of the junction to get to and from Albany. The Toledo branch takes a northeast heading, trading the rows of houses and streets for rows of crops and open fields. The Toledo hauler races over the west switch of Ashahr. On a much different day, its counterpart, the Toledo patch, heads eastbound at a much slower pace. Ashahr is the longest siding on the Toledo branch, breaking the tape measure at 6,145 feet. In early 2020, loads of liquefied propane gas were brought here for temporary storage by the westbound hauler. Ashahr is often used by the Toledo trains, West Sider, and Corvallis Local for spotting and picking up cars. With tanks being stored here, cars are now swapped at either Corvallis or Granger, the next siding to the east. The patch races past milepost 699 at Ashahr. The siding was named by Southern Pacific after the Ashahr family who lived in the area. However, the name was misspelled, with the B in Ashahr becoming an H. It was never corrected, and the name Ashahr stuck. In the early years of the Willamette and Pacific Railroad, an effort was made to correct the misspelling to reflect the Ashahr family. Ultimately, that failed in favor of tradition, and timetables to this day refer to this siding as Ashahr, with an H. Continuing east of Ashahr, the line passes the siding of Granger and changes course to nearly due east, crossing the Bowers Slough Bridge at milepost 695.7. We again show the classic slug sets crossing Bowers Slough with the ex-Palouse River and Coulee City GP35 dead in consist. This locomotive is leased to Watco, which switches the GP mill in Toledo. The train is now shorter, having dropped most of its loaded boxcars at Ashahr. The 3001 is again on the point of the westbound Toledo Holler as the train sprints out of Albany. These scenes were shot in June and July of 2016, when the hauler was making an early evening departure from Albany. Today, after being put together, the train was taken west and tied down just north of the Northwest Scenic Drive crossing in North Albany. The hauler crew was shuttled to the train and prepared to depart at 8 p.m. The engineer wastes little time getting the train up to track speed. North Albany is milepost 692.5 and was originally called West Albany by the Oregon Pacific Railroad, being that it is on the west side of the Willamette River. The North Albany Depot was a 28-foot boxcar that was converted into a passenger shelter, as seen in this photo from around 1920. A yard limit sign guards the west approach to one of the most remarkable structures on the Toledo branch, the Albany Trestle. With a total length of 3,954 feet, the trestle includes a bridge that crosses the Willamette River, which cannot be seen from this end. The westbound Toledo hauler comes off the bridge in Dynamics with loads of wood chips for the paper mill. Rewinding the clock 60 years, we find the yard limit sign a little farther west of the grade crossing. A typical scene from the 1950s are the water barrels located at intervals across a large wooden trestle. The Albany Bridge was originally constructed out of wood and had a swing span over the Willamette River to allow passage of steamships. The Pomona heads north through the open span of the Oregon Pacific Bridge after departing Albany. The Willamette River has a long history of flooding. These scenes are from the winter of 1890, after severe storms caused the Willamette and surrounding rivers to leave their banks and test the integrity of man's ingenuity. It's the 4th day of February 1890, and we are looking west across a trestle which is jammed full of debris thanks to strong flowing currents to the north. These railroad men endure the rain that is continuing to fall on this dark Tuesday afternoon. Needless to say, the river eventually subsided, and the bridge and railroad was rebuilt, with lots of determination and elbow grease. There have been a few recorded accidents in the bridge's history, like this scene of the NS Bentley, which is riding a little low in the water after striking the bridge. A few gentlemen on board the doomed ship still pose for a photograph. In 1954, an eastbound train rear-ended another that was stopped for a flare on the bridge. The SP-5201 slammed into the caboose, shoving it into its own train, killing the rear-end brakeman and injuring 2 other men. The engine was running long hood forward, and the lack of visibility on the curve prevented the engineer from seeing the caboose until it was too late. In another flood scene, an eastbound glides over the deep waters toward the station at Albany, which hopefully is high and dry. Fast forwarding a few decades, SP's Snow Peak logger heads westbound over the trestle on its way to the Willamette Industries sawmill in Dallas, Oregon. Today, the bridge is mostly obscured by growing trees and a growing community. This is the east approach to the Willamette River. Getting down to water level gives us a cool view of the permanently closed swing span on a hot summer afternoon as the Toledo Patch crosses the river. Today's crew left their train at Ashahr before continuing into Albany with only a couple of loads of kiln-dried lumber, which they picked up there. The best way to see the bridges is from the air, and we pick a logger train that didn't have to make any stops on its eastbound run from Toledo. The wood supports are now replaced with steel and concrete, and a golf course borders the south side of the bridge. One thing that hasn't changed in the past 137 years is the active railroad that still crosses the Willamette River into Albany. After crossing the river, the railroad remains elevated on the east side, flying over the former Oregon Electric line, which parallels Water Avenue. The bridge continues over First Avenue with grade crossings for 5 city blocks before reaching the junction with the UP Main Line. To access Portland and Western's Albany Yard, the train must cross UP's Brooklyn subdivision, which runs south out of Portland and is part of the I-5 corridor that runs up and down the West Coast. Originally, a turntable and roundhouse were located straight across from what is now the UP. A Corvallis and Eastern roundhouse crew take time from their duties for a picture on the turntable, with CNE number 5 in between runs. The roundhouse survived into the early diesel years. Today, trains cross the UP after getting permission from Dispatcher 68 in Omaha and shuffle into Albany Yard just south of the Highway 20 overpass. A signal guards the eastern approach to the bridge at 2nd Avenue. Although it may be confused as a lunar, this signal is actually considered white and will only drop to red if a car, truck, or train on the Oregon Electric line were to crash into the bridge. Something that is not unheard of. Just after sunset, PNWR 2306 leads the nocturnal Toledo hauler out of the yard and past the white signal. Tucked into the wood chips this evening are half a dozen tank cars loaded with LPG. These are the same cars we saw at Ashahr, an unusual commodity to be seen on the Toledo hauler. The eastbound patch with the GP35 unit is seen one final time as it slowly comes off the bridge toward the junction with the UP. Normally, the train will take the south leg of the Y and pull straight into Albany. But with a dead unit on the west end, the crew is about to do something different. Our attention is diverted onto the UP Brooklyn subdivision as Amtrak 11, the southbound Coast Starlight, passes on the main on its run between Seattle and Los Angeles. The train will soon be stopping at the depot, on the other side of the overpass. While our backs were turned, the Toledo patch has taken the north leg of the Y, which parallels the UP to a small yard on PNW's Oregon Electric branch. The train will then back into Albany Yard, thus turning the power around for tonight's westbound move, and with the dead Watco engine again in the trailing position. Setting up at Albany Yard, power for the Toledo hauler back toward their train. The track in the foreground is the UP main line. With the train together and air test complete, the hauler pulls toward the junction under the Highway 20 overpass and waits for a signal to proceed west. The train will have to wait, as UP has trains of their own to run. UP 5540 takes a southbound chicken feed train through Albany on its way to California. A remote-controlled GE brings up the rear of this heavy grain train, and several more remote-controlled swing helpers will be added at Eugene for the stiff climb through the Oregon Cascades. But that's a story for another time. Clouds have moved in as a northbound Amtrak Cascades Talgo train makes an afternoon stop at the Albany station. These passenger trains are run jointly by the states of Oregon and Washington and are operated by Amtrak. These trains only use one locomotive, in this case a Siemens Charger, and operate in push-pull mode. On the rear end is what is known as a cab car, which is operated by the engineer when traveling in the opposite direction. It is a peculiar-looking unit to say the least, and takes some getting used to after being with standard cab EMDs all day. While the Talgo set heads for Portland, the Toledo hauler waits in the yard for nightfall. The Toledo line started as the dream of Colonel Thomas E. Hogg for a transcontinental railroad between the West Coast and Idaho via Santiam Pass in the Oregon Cascades. The line between Yaquina and West Albany was completed by 1886, and made it to this side of the river the following year, when the Albany trestle was completed. Hogg's line was constructed as far east as Idana, which turned out to be the end of the line for Colonel Hogg. His dreams sank along with two of his steamships near Newport in 1887 and 1888. The Yaquina Bay was just too shallow and too dangerous to be a reliable seaport. The railroad was sold to lumberman A.B. Hammond in 1894, reorganized again as the Corvallis and Eastern in 1897, and 10 years later, the C&E found itself under the control of E.H. Harriman and the Southern Pacific, which finally took over operations in 1915. In 1993, the Willamette and Pacific began operations as SP spun off much of its branch lines in Oregon, and today, the Portland and Western carries the torch. Although it never lived up to its expectations as a transcontinental railroad, Colonel Hogg's line to the Oregon coast has played an important role for the many communities that have thrived along its steel rails for more than a century. Darkness has fallen and the evening's cool air brings steam from the loads of wood chips, as tonight's Toledo hauler continues a tradition that started nearly 140 years ago. We hope you've enjoyed your tour of this interesting branch to places seldom traveled. May its rails stay polished for many years to come. As always, until next time, thanks for watching.